what's happening is that Donald Trump has betrayed MAGA because the first thing that he's promised MAGA is no more wars. He started this war unprovoked against Iran, and this is seen as a betrayal. And that's why so many influential MAGA people, such as Tucker Carlson, have come out and opposed this war because it's a betrayal of all that MAGA stands for, which is America first. So he's doing this, again, to put his enemies on a pedestal. But he also has to think ahead and say, how do I redeem myself in the eyes of MAGA? How do I get out of this dumpster fire? And so at some point, when it's clear that this war is just a complete dumpster fire and he needs to bail, okay? He's going to bail because he's not invested in this war. His job is to get a third term, and whether or not America wins this war, loses this war, he doesn't really care. It's not a factor in his calculations. But he needs to figure out how to create an off-ramp. So ask yourself this question. Why is Tulsi Gabbard in his cabinet? Why is she director of national intelligence? She's a Democrat. Why would she be given such a powerful position in Washington, D.C.? And the reason why is everyone associates her with anti-war, anti-military industrial complex. In other words, Donald Trump came into his second term creating two camps. You have the anti-war camp, J.D. Vance and Tulsi Gabbard. And you have like the pro-war people, Marco Rubio, Jared Kushner, Peter Hegseth, right? These guys. So it's clear that there's this mass division in the White House. So why would Trump do that? Because Trump is trying to create a narrative where at first he was bamboozled by Marco Rubio and Peter Hegseth and Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. But then J.D. Vance, Tulsi Gabbard, they pray to God or whatever, and he saw the light. And then he joined J.D. Vance and Tulsi Gabbard in opposing this war. And that's his off-ramp. And then J.D. Vance and Tulsi Gabbard will say to MAGA, we have to forgive him because he's our only hope to stop this war.
How do you predict the future?
So in my predictive model, there are three pillars. Okay? The most important is game theory. Second is historical patterns. The third is eschatology. Game theory. So I used to play a lot of poker. It's usually tournament poker. So I have a lot of time to kill. So I spend a lot of time just analyzing the metagame. Like, who are these people? Why are they doing what they're doing? And what I discovered playing poker is that there are no dumb players in the game. They're all rational, but they have their own different perspective on how the game should be played. And if you spend enough time just analyzing a player, you can figure out the person's entire strategy. And then I recognized that, well, we can apply this metaphor to geopolitics, which is to say that each nation state has its own particular worldview as determined by its culture, its history, its political system. And then it's going to take this worldview and develop a strategy for how to navigate the world. And sometimes these worldviews will come into conflict with each other. And so once you start to recognize that the world is not set by a universal standard, but rather that the world is flexible and dynamic and open, and that each player is participating in a zero-sum game and trying to optimize his or her advantage in this game, then the world makes a lot more sense. The problem with this is to do game theory properly, you would need perfect information, right? So go back to the poker table analogy where if I'm able to see everyone's cards, right? If I'm able to see everyone's minds, then I can predict exactly how they behave. But you don't have that perfect information. You can only make guesses. And this is even more true in geopolitics because you don't have access to the nation's top minds. You don't know who the leaders are. You don't understand how the political system works. You don't understand this dynamic, so it's very hard for you to gauge their behavior. So what I do next then is, fine, I don't have this perfect information, but am I able to go back in history and look at events that are similar to today? And then am I able to draw analogies between the past and the present? And the third thing I will look at is the idea of eschatology. Eschatology comes from the Greek word eschaton, which means the end. So literally it means the study of the end. Each religion has its own understanding and theory of how the world ends or how we become reunited with God. And eschatology is often connected with the most extreme religious elements. And the reason why is that eschatology is very compelling. Because if you see the ending, if you know that Jesus can return, if certain things were to line up together, then Jesus would return, then that makes you much more determined and motivated to actually fulfill this prophecy, right? So the prophecy becomes a plan. And why eschatology is important is that people who do believe in this eschatology are much more motivated than others, much more energetic, much more cohesive than others, which means that they have more power than other people. And so they are the players to watch out for in this game. And so if you look at what's happening in the Middle East, you can make the argument that a lot of it is driven by eschatology, in that you have these Christian Zionists who believe that by manipulating certain events in the Middle East, by provoking a war there basically, you will usher in the end times. For Christian Zionists, it means the rapture and the return of Jesus. For religious Jews, it means the coming of the Messiah and the coming of the Messianic age. Also, what people don't appreciate is that not only is eschatology a prophecy and a plan, but it's also a hidden history. And the reason why is that we don't have much written history, maybe since the Greeks, okay? But the Greeks go back 3,000 years. So it's not that much. We've been around for at least 10,000 years. You go back to Göbekli Tepe in the Ice Age cave paintings. Okay, so we go back a long time, but we don't have that history. In fact, we don't have most of our history. So what religion does is that religion takes the broad history and allegorizes it into narratives, into stories, into religious beliefs that capture the essence of this history. If we believe that history repeats itself, or there's a certain pattern to history, what religion is it deciphers for you these patterns of history. So think of astrology, right? Astrology is trying to reveal to you the patterns of the stars, right? Well, eschatology is very similar to astrology in this way, in that eschatology is not just a plan, it's not just a prophecy, but it's also a hidden framework of how events will turn out. And if you look at eschatology, it's mainly about the decline of empire, the decline of civilization. And if you look at what's happening today from a historical perspective, it is the decline of empire, the decline of civilization. And so eschatology provides you with a pretty good framework of how this thing will unfold. So let's look at the most dominant eschatologies, okay? So you have first start with the Jewish eschatology. The Jews believe that they are the chosen people, and the apex of their civilization was King David's kingdom, the Davidic kingdom, and King Solomon. Okay, and this was when King Solomon built Solomon's temple, which was the house of God. But unfortunately, the Jewish people were not loyal. They were unfaithful. So they started to marry foreign women, which brought in foreign gods. And then Yahweh became angry at the infidelity of the Jews. And this allowed invaders, such as the Babylonians and the Assyrians, to conquer Jerusalem. Eventually, this led to the Jewish diaspora, the scattering of the Jews. But even in the diaspora, they longed to return to Jerusalem, to be reunited with their God. And in the Jewish tradition, when God is ready, when the Jewish people are ready for this reunion, the Messiah will come. The Messiah will lead the Jewish people back to the promised land. He will build the nation of Israel, and he will summon the diaspora to return to Israel, and he will build the third temple. Eventually, he will face his enemies in the war of Gog and Magog, but he will triumph, and this will usher in the Messianic age. As Jewish people, our main responsibility is to reflect deeply on who we are, engage in spiritual alchemy, and once we engage in a long process of redemption, once our hearts open up to God, then God will send us Messiah. So be a good person and wait and be patient, okay? So that's the standard mainstream Jewish understanding. But then you have these extremists who believe that is not God's intention. God's intention is for the Jews to prove that they love God and they desire reunion with God. And so it must be the Jews to act out first before God sends his Messiah. And that means you must first reconstitute the nation of Israel. You must build the third temple. You must fight the war of Gog and Magog. And when the Jews have done all they can, have repented, and yearn for reunion with God, then God will intervene and set the world right. And that is when the Messianic age will occur. But you must first make the sacrifice necessary in order to welcome the Messiah and the coming of Yahweh. Okay, so you can see how in the first iteration, yeah, it's interesting, but in the second iteration, there's sort of a passion and excitement to it, where it's just like, wow, there's this grand historical script being played out. It's all part of God's divine plan. And I can play my part in achieving this divine plan. So why shouldn't I? If I want to prove myself worthy, shouldn't I do my part to achieve this plan? So I just mentioned the Jewish eschatology, but there are others. There's the Orthodox eschatology. There's the Catholic one. There's the Protestant one, the Christian Zionist one. So there are all these different eschatologies out there. And what's really interesting is at certain points, they converge together, meaning they align at certain points, meaning that these are different religious traditions. Again, we're talking only about a minority, these extremists, right? Maybe 1% of the entire cohort, okay? But these are the most energetic, they're the most unified, they're the most determined, right? And if they're working together to achieve a certain script, and if the script is similar at certain points, then you can be certain or confident that these things will turn out. Because at the end of the day, we're the players in this grand historical narrative. So what we do is what determines the history. If you just look at certain convergence points, it's amazing how they align, okay? So one major convergence point is the reconstitution of the nation of Israel. Then another convergence point is war and chaos in the Middle East, which is happening right now. Another convergence point is the building of the third temple. And this is problematic because right now, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site in the Muslim world, it actually sits on where the third temple should be. And so if the Al-Aqsa Mosque would be destroyed, this would trigger a religious war. But again, if these eschatologies are really powerful and true, they all agree there will be a religious war in the Middle East, which will lead eventually to the war of Gog and Magog, which is also what they agree on. They also agree, this is really interesting, is that America will not be part of this narrative. In other words, what they all believe is that America will lose this war against Iran and retreat back to North America and be engulfed in civil war. That's what they all believe. Yeah, so you have this convergence, and that's how I'm able to make these predictions, because, well, if they want to behave in this way and they're powerful people, well, they'll probably succeed.